big as the one that you just assigned me. I didn't realize I was going to say all those things. I was last week at a gathering. The introduction reminds me. I was last week at a gathering. I won't mention the gathering, but truly a gathering of the enemy. Really powerful group, and they invited Henry Kissinger to speak. And they call them sires at this place. The people who run the seminars within this big gathering introduced Dr. Kissinger by saying, "Our next speaker needs no introduction. He's ubiquitous. He's spoken here 18 of the last 20 years, blah, 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 blah. You know, may I give you Henry Kissinger?" Kissinger stumbled up to the stage and said, "Although it is true, perhaps, that I don't require an introduction, there is no one who has ever spoken here who enjoys a generous introduction more than I." Anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about philosophy because I'm not a philosopher. I'm not going to talk too much about economics. I'm not an economist. I'm a speculator. And I'm going to talk about speculation, and I'm going to talk about your response to society and your response to the state, and how, although many of you, probably all of you, are, or would describe yourself as libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, your buy-in to collectivism reduces your own investment performance. This talk came about as a consequence of a very non-libertarian talk I gave at a very non-libertarian meeting, an investment conference that Giant was at, and it was a talk I gave on investment risk. And during this particular conference, there were a whole bunch of speakers. In fact, all the speakers. It was sort of, you know, one of these gold bug doom and gloom, God, guns, and gold gatherings. And there was a whole discussion of political of risks, various types of risks. There were interest rate risks, market risks, and cyclical risks, and this risk and that risk. And what I wanted to point out to people was that the worst risks that they faced, probably as humans, but certainly as investors or speculators, were very, very, very conveniently located, immediately to the left of the right ear and to the right of the left ear. And that in fact, we are the authors of most of our investment misfortune. That isn't to say that the factors that surround us, the external factors that surround us, don't present risks, sometimes fatal risks. But I would argue that those risks are uncontrollable. And the only thing that we can control, in fact, the only thing that determines realistically whether we're going to be successful or unsuccessful in investing, probably in other aspects of life, but I'm not qualified to comment on those other aspects of life, are our own responses to the risks that come from the outside. I guess what I'm trying to say is that at least in my life, in every realm of my life, but certainly in speculation and investment, my worst wounds were all self-inflicted. And one of the interesting things that I observe among investors and speculators, the community that I know best, including you, libertarian or anarcho-capitalist investors or speculators, is despite the fact that we know and mouth discussions of self-reliance and distrust in the state, many of us misunderstand the nature of the risks and the nature of the protections that are offered up. And as a consequence of not taking responsibility ourselves for responding to these risks, our behaviors are suboptimal, our performance is suboptimal. Let's talk about a few of them. One of my favorites is, of course, political risk. And for those of you who don't know, I'm in the natural resources business. I'm involved in speculating and occasionally investing, seldom these days, but mostly speculating, in businesses like mining, oil and gas, forestry, agriculture. And these are businesses that are particularly susceptible to political risk. Those of you who are smart enough to be in businesses that are less capital intensive, those of you who are involved in intellectual property businesses, if you suffer the depredation of a society and a state, even if I owned a ship, something mobile, an asset that was mobile, If you run into some problems with your own society, you leave. You go somewhere else. It's very, very, very difficult not very difficult, but it's much more difficult for the collective to steal from you than it is for the collective to steal from me. Mines, if you're fortunate enough to find them, are very stable, and hence politicians love them. They're wonderful targets. There's no better target than a mine. You put $2 or $3 billion into it, it's stuck, it's there, it's fixed, it's visible, and they grab it, they tax it. What's interesting about our response to political risk, all of our response to political risk, is despite the fact that all of us, to some degree, believe that all governments are evil, the most efficient governments are the most evil, when it comes to assessing political risk, forget this. Specifically, political risk is a risk that we seem to respond to emotionally rather than rationally, meaning that political risk for us is still driven not by our understanding of the state, but rather by what we see on television. In the mining business right now, the political risk that's evident, where could we say? Argentina. Malawi, Argentina, places like this. Places where the experience of political risk has been most recent are judged by us to be the most extreme because we feel. In fact, when Mrs. Kirchner nationalized or stole YPF, the response to that was that small cap companies invested in Argentina fell by 75%. I would argue with you that those companies almost instantaneously became 75% less risky. Political risk, in one sense, is a function of the price that you pay to experience it or avoid it. And when people look at the political risks offered up by Argentina, when they respond to their feelings, as opposed to thinking through things, they expose themselves to much more political risk. Let me give you an example. I have an Argentine client and friend, a wealthy Argentine, and I was inquiring of him after the nationalization of YPF what he felt the risks associated with mining projects in Argentina under development was. And his response to me was very illustrative, and it's something that all of us should listen to. He said, Mrs. Kirchner stole YPF because she wanted to steal $1 billion a month to fund politically expedient domestic spending programs. The idea that she would steal a deposit that she had to spend $3 billion on before she could steal the cash flow is nonsensical. So the political risk associated with Mrs. Kirchner in the context of her understanding of her own self-interest would lead you to think that the political risk in Argentina, perhaps after the event, was less than it was before. But that wasn't the price expectation. The other thing that I think is interesting about political risk, especially when I hear this objection from libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, is that political risk in third world nations, political risk in frontier nations, and in particular, political risk in non-white nations is less extreme than political risk here. It's as though our community believes that money that is stolen from you in English by Caucasians, according to the rule of law, is somehow less gone than money that's stolen from you. It's interesting, and by the way, I'm not entirely immune to this over my life. I immediately react negatively to situations I don't understand as well. But what I have learned in 30 years of practicing speculation in natural resource businesses around the world, and I'm not making a joke of this, the worst personal experience that I, Rick Rule, have had with political risk came in a jurisdiction that I knew very well. It occurred in the People's Republic of California. In that jurisdiction, I was part of discovery of a deposit called the Castle Mountain Discovery by a company called Viceroy Resources. We discovered this deposit, fair and square, according to all the rules made by and provided for. Most of the deposit, in fact, was on deeded fee land. Some of it was, in fact, on state land. And despite the